Timothy, you are reporting and writing and having lectures regarding, what's happening in Ukraine, the Ukrainian history in a lot of influential foreign media. And what do you think? Is anything changing the understanding within the last months, especially?
Well, many things have changed. First of all, in the entire world, including the United States, everyone is now aware that there is a Ukraine, which is itself very significant, and that there's some kind of Ukrainian question. The second thing which has changed is that the debate is now fully internationalized. People all over the world, Brazil, South Africa, wherever, have some kind of view on this question. The third thing which has changed is that everyone is aware that this is a propaganda war. In the first few months, people were not aware of that, and much of what I tried to do at the beginning was just to try to separate out propaganda from reality. Now everyone knows that there is a propaganda war. It doesn't mean that they're resisting it or understanding it, but they know that it's going on. And I suppose the final thing which has changed is that enough has happened that is seen by Western institutions as right in Ukraine. So, for example, the presidential elections, that the West, at least the political class in the West, has tilted towards Ukraine, at least for the time being. That's new. That's different than in February and March.
And for a while, Ukraine was dragged into the discussion about neo-Nazi in power, but now there is a lot of, if we talk globally in this discussion, words about American interference, and how relevant is that, and how to get out of this another pattern Ukraine issue is taken to.
Yeah. No, those have been the two big propaganda pushes. The first is that you can't support Ukraine because whatever's happening in Ukraine is just a fascist push. No one really, even stupid people, don't believe that at this point. And so the second big push has been to say that it's all about America. And the reason that that's so intelligent is that there are many people around the world who, for reasons that could be very good, resent the United States. And so if you say, oh, this is some American offensive, you can get a lot of sympathy in India or in Latin America. Russia then looks like the little guy, right? So when you say it's a geopolitical competition between America and Russia, that makes Russia look like the little guy, which is resisting the big guy. Whereas in fact, Russia is the big guy, which is bullying the little guy, which is Ukraine. The other reason why that propaganda is so dangerous is that when you say everything is geopolitics, you remove all the people. So all the Ukrainians who went to the Maidan risking their lives, all of the Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting, none of these people exist. All the Ukrainian voters who went to elect their president, all the Ukrainians who are going to vote in October for their parliament, they don't exist because all that matters supposedly are these two powers, right? And of course, looking at reality from the United States, I mean, our policy towards the Maidan, towards Ukraine, has been so unbelievably hesitant and almost non-existent. I say this with respect to the diplomats and so on, but we have done unbelievably little, in fact, towards Ukraine. I almost feel like we should, since the propaganda against us is so strong, we should just do a whole lot more anyway, right? Because everyone already thinks we're doing so much, we probably should just do a lot more.
Divide Europe and European Union. How successful he is in that?
Well, I mean, as I've been saying all along, I think his approach is basically counterproductive. I think he has, I think what he's done has been against the interests of the Russian state and the Russian people pretty dramatically. What he has done is forced the Europeans, or many Europeans, to see Russia as an adversary. It's very hard to make Europeans see anybody as an adversary, but he's succeeded. And in that sense, he's committed a huge strategic blunder, which I think might affect generations of Russians. Because Russia has power insofar as it has a choice between Europe and China. If Putin removes the European choice and Russia is doomed to China, then Russia is much less important, and Russians have much less freedom to decide their future. So in general, I think it's been counterproductive. At a day-to-day level, of course, I mean, the Russians have done a good job at separating the German far left from. They've done a good job in Italy and in Spain. They have fomented some divisions here and there, but basically what they've done is they've generated, for the very first time in history, an EU foreign policy. There's never been a European Union foreign policy. Sanctions are the first one. So Russia can congratulate itself on inventing EU foreign policy. I don't think that's what they were after. So I don't all in all think that that this is a success for them.
You were the first to ask the to ask the question from President Poroshenko and about like why EU, what Ukraine can give to the EU. Are you satisfied with the answer?
Look, I think that's a question he's going to be getting over and over again, and it probably wouldn't hurt to work on it a little bit, his answer. I mean, from my point of view as a historian, the basic answer to that question is Ukraine is the missing piece of the European security environment. Ukraine was the main battlefield of the Second World War. It was one of the battlefields of the First World War. It was a source of geostrategic competition between Poland and Russia and then Germany and the Soviet Union. If Ukraine can be moved into a zone of stability, that is a huge step forward towards securing Europe. But there are also little particular things that could be said, like that oligarchy is not just a Ukrainian problem, it's also an Austrian and a British and a European problem. And only cooperation between Ukraine and Europe can help with those kinds of international corruption issues. You could point out that Ukrainian agriculture is the third or fourth most important in the world, and in the long run that's going to be very important for Europeans. You could point out that adding Ukraine creates a much bigger internal market, making it much bigger than the North American market, for example. There are lots of things like that which one could say.
There is a lot of discussion and about that there should be not just the military option in the resolving the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, and there is no doubt on that. But how important is the military option?
Well, I mean, the answer to that is Crimea. If a state can't use force, then that state really doesn't exist. I mean, much as I'm against violence and against war, a state that can't use force really doesn't exist. So I think it is important for Ukraine to demonstrate that it can generate an army, that it can actually use force on its own territory, that Ukrainians are willing to take risks for the sovereignty of their country. That's important. It's important chiefly to bring the conversation into reality, so that it's not all, if only one side uses force, then that side also decides what language is going to be used, it decides what the peace settlement is going to be like. It's important for the Ukrainian state to be in a position where it's not just being dictated to. Now, what a political solution means, if only Russia uses force, a political solution means that Russia gets more territory. At this point, a political solution has to mean that the Ukrainian state has something to offer to all of its citizens. And in this way, I don't see Luhansk and Donetsk as being that different from the rest of Ukraine. The reason why people go on the Maidan is because the Ukrainian state doesn't function. The reason why there has to be so much civil society is because local administrations don't work. Those are the things that have to be fixed. I mean, whether one is in Zaporizhia or in Ivano-Frankivsk.
And you mentioned that still there are a lot of people around who are asking the question about the Ukrainian identity. It's finally becoming an issue, yeah? But what do you think, and while this discussion today, we just had an issue about the Russian identity. So what is how now for the Ukrainians and the Russians to deal with each other at this point?
Well, at this point, I'm not going to tell the Ukrainians and the Russians what to do. I will just say that it is normal to have a long-term relationship where some elements of culture are present on both sides. That's normal. It's normal that there's a Canada, right? What makes Canada different from America? It's a little bit hard to say, right? What makes Belgium different from France? Where is the line exactly between France and Italy? It's normal for these things to be fluid and ambiguous, but nevertheless, people have the right to assert themselves politically and to say, I belong to this society rather than that society. I think what we have in this conflict is a Russian identity problem masquerading as a Ukrainian identity problem. I think it's when Russians aren't sure where their own country begins and ends, when Russians think that people belong to their nation and those people don't think so, that's a problem for Russians. I think the identity problem in Ukraine, although it exists, is actually rather minor compared to the identity problem in Russia. And this conflict in Ukraine is a way for Russians to work out their identity problems. Unfortunately, it's the worst way. The best way would be just to talk about it and to laugh about it.
Last time we talked about the importance of the reforms in Ukraine, but how it's possible to make reforms while the war is going on?
I don't really buy that argument. I mean, that is everyone says you can't do reforms during a war, but that's not what history says. History shows that when you have to fight a war, you either generate more state capacity or you die, right? So the United States as it exists today is largely a result of the buildup of state capacity during the Second World War. That's just the way things work. So during the war, you have to build up the army, but you also have to improve relations with companies. You have to make sure that everything's efficient. So I don't really buy that argument. I think that the war means that you have to reform. It doesn't mean that you can't reform.
Is it possible to reform Ukraine having oligarchs?
Look, this is a natural, again, this is a natural transition. I mean, I'll use another American analogy. America in the 1890s was not so different from Ukraine today. Oligarchs have to reach a point where they give all their money away and decide they're going to be good civil servants like that, you know, and you can't make them do it, but you know, sometimes they do it. And that said, okay, and I will say something more serious. One thing which is very important about decentralization in Ukraine is that you have to create local political classes. You have to create political parties that come from the ground up rather than being the creations of oligarchs. So long as you have clan politics, there will be corruption. The only way ultimately to get around that is to have decentralization, to have elections for the mayor's office, for example, that everyone cares about. It's the kind of pluralist, oligarchical pluralism that you have now can be a stage towards a better kind of pluralism, but that depends a bit on the oligarchs.
There is always a demand like to support Ukraine, you know, from the EU, from the US, but sometimes it's getting too general, and if you ask the general question, you know, ask in general to support, sometimes you get a pretty ambiguous answer. So what, being realistic, what kind of real support Ukraine can have? And can like demand that it's, you know, probable and realistic rather than like, you know, talking about NATO, knowing that, you know, there won't be boots on the ground? Well,
the big opportunity is the association agreement. With the association agreement, you should try to get as many European Union experts inside Ukrainian ministries as possible, and vice versa. Have a lot of circulation of elites. Get Ukrainians moving into Brussels and European capitals to see how things are done there, and get people from the new members and the old members here looking over people's shoulders and trying to figure out how things are happening here. The association agreement is the big opportunity, I think, to make things work better. Aside from that, it's all small stuff. Like, if we want to help Ukraine, we should come to Ukraine. If we want to help Ukraine, we should have Ukrainian students come to American and European universities. If we want to help Ukraine, we should we should send our journalists here, right, as opposed to just copying things that are written on the internet. You know, aside from that, it's basically small stuff. I mean, from my point of view, the main thing we can do to help Ukraine is to make sure that we're telling the truth about Ukraine rather than listening to things which come from other places.
Then we're asking everybody this question. I know you're a historian, not futurologist, but still, what do you think? What would be Ukraine in a year?
Yeah, that's, you know, when historians aren't getting the past wrong, we're getting the future wrong. I'm still cautiously optimistic about Ukraine in a year. I think Ukraine in a year will be in a better position than it is right now. I don't think that the conflict in Luhansk and Donetsk will be resolved. I think because it's going to be a long-term conflict, it's best to invest in little mechanisms of trying to attract the population towards the center now. But I'm cautiously optimistic. I think Ukrainians have learned certain things. That said, I mean, Ukraine has a very unpredictable neighbor, and so anything that I say, I have to add that proviso that I have very little idea what Putin is going to do next. I thought he was going to invade Ukraine 6 months ago. That turned out to be true, but at this point I've run out of predictions. Okay, thanks.
Thanks so much.